All right, let's get into it. Today we're unpacking one of the most distinctive and maybe one of the most misunderstood features of Catholicism, the papacy. We're going to explore the scriptural, historical, and theological arguments from our source material for why this one person, the Pope, is seen as the visible head of the Church on earth.
So let's just start with the biggest question right out of the gate. Why a pope? I mean, really, what's the deal? For over 1 billion Catholics, the Pope is this direct spiritual link to the Apostle Peter, and through him, to Christ himself. But where did that idea actually come from? Was it something that was invented later on, or does it really trace all the way back to the beginning?
To get to the bottom of that, our source material gives us a super clear roadmap. We're going to start with what it calls Christ's original design, then dig into the key biblical passages, the rock, keys, and sheep. After that, we'll trace the historical chain, try to understand the logic for having a visible head, tackle some common objections, and finally, look at the Pope's role as a servant of unity.
Okay, let's dive right into our first section, Christ's design. Now, the core argument of our source material here is, well, it's pretty bold. It says the papacy isn't some human idea that came along later. It claims it was established by Jesus Christ himself, right from the start.
And here is that central claim, stated as directly as possible. Our source presents this as the bedrock belief that everything else is built on. It's framing the papacy not as just another human institution, but as a divine one. So, okay, with a claim that big, what's the evidence to back it up?
Well, the case kicks off with Scripture. The source material points to 3 key moments in the Gospels that are seen as the foundational pillars of Peter's unique authority as the leader of the apostles.
Now, this is probably the most famous passage of the bunch. But what's really interesting here is the context. This whole scene happens at a place called Caesarea Philippi, which was this major center for pagan worship. It's right there, surrounded by temples to other gods, that Jesus renames Simon to Peter. And in the Bible, when God gives you a new name, it is a huge deal. It always means you've been given a new divine mission.
And this is where the original language becomes so important. Our source emphasizes that Jesus would have been speaking Aramaic, and in Aramaic, the word for Peter's new name and the word for rock are the exact same word, Kepha. So what Jesus would have said is, "You are Kepha, and on this Kepha I will build my church." The wordplay is a direct one-to-one link, identifying Peter the man as the foundation stone.
So the crucial point here is that these biblical moments aren't seen as just isolated events. They're viewed as a cumulative case that defines 3 distinct roles for Peter. First, in Matthew, he's the prime minister, given the keys to govern, an image that would instantly remind his audience of the royal steward who ran the king's household. Second, in John, he's the chief shepherd, told to take care of the entire flock. And third, in Luke, he becomes the strengthener, the one Jesus prays for specifically, so that he can go and confirm the others in their faith.
Okay, so if Christ established this office in Peter, what happened after Peter died? Did it just end with him? Well, the source argues that the authority wasn't just personal to Peter, but was passed down through an unbroken chain of successors, the bishops of Rome.
This timeline really highlights key moments the source uses to show that this idea of Roman authority was recognized from the very beginning. For example, as early as 96 AD, you have the 4th Pope, Clement, stepping in to settle a dispute in Corinth, and this is while the Apostle John was still alive. A few decades later, you have St. Irenaeus pointing to the Roman succession as the benchmark for what correct doctrine is.
In this moment, this is powerful. At the Council of Chalcedon in 451, when the bishops heard the teaching of Pope Leo the Great, they didn't just say, "Yep, we agree with Leo." They declared, "Peter has spoken through Leo." The source presents this as crystal clear evidence that the early church saw the Bishop of Rome as the living, breathing voice of Peter himself.
So we've seen the scriptural and historical arguments, but the source also asks a theological question. Why? Why would God set up the church this way? What's the practical need for a single, visible leader?
The reasoning presented is that just like God became visible in the person of Jesus, his church needs a visible principle of unity on earth. You know, with a final authority, disputes can actually be settled. Without one, the source argues, you just get endless doctrinal confusion. The papacy, in this view, acts as an anchor of certainty and a guard against division, preventing a situation where every believer basically becomes their own pope.
And this leads us right into one of the most misunderstood ideas of all, papal infallibility. The source is very, very specific here. It is not a claim that the Pope is perfect or that he can't sin.
It's not about his personal opinions on science or politics. It is an extremely narrow protection from error that only applies when he officially defines a doctrine on faith or morals for the entire church.
And to put that into perspective, just think about this number. In the past 170 years, this very specific power has been formally used exactly twice, once in 1854 and again in 1950. That really highlights that this isn't some kind of superpower the Pope uses every day. It's an extremely rare charism reserved for extraordinary moments.
All right, let's now turn to some of those common questions and objections that the source material tackles head-on. And this is a big one, right? History has had some popes who are anything but holy. How does the source reconcile that with the idea of a divine office? The argument here makes a crucial distinction between the man and the office. A sinful pope doesn't invalidate the papacy any more than a corrupt judge invalidates the entire justice system. In fact, the source kind of flips it and says the real miracle is that even during these periods of great corruption, the core doctrines of the faith were never officially taught in error. That, it suggests, is proof of divine protection. Okay, here's another common misunderstanding. Does the Pope's authority mean he's claiming to be on the same level as God?
And the source gives a very firm no on this one. It points to one of the Pope's most ancient titles, servant of the servants of God. This frames the role not as one of ultimate power or privilege, but as one of immense burden and service to the unity of the whole church.
And that brings us right to the conclusion of the argument. After all the scripture, the history, and the theology, the sorceress boils the purpose of the papacy down to one core idea: unity.
So the final thought that our source material leaves us with is this really provocative question. It frames the sheer survival of the papacy, despite all the internal corruption and external attacks, as maybe the ultimate proof of its divine origin. It really leaves you to wonder whether human effort alone could possibly account for its 2,000-year endurance.